Welcome to this explainer, everyone. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here. Today, we're going on a truly fascinating journey, moving from the abstract, high-altitude heights of moral philosophy straight down into the grounded, highly applied world of organizational behavior. We're going to unpack the anatomy of choice. We'll look at why we make the choices we do, why they sometimes literally tear us apart, and most importantly, how we can systematically master the art of navigating our differences. If you've ever felt stuck in a conflict that just seemed to go in endless circles, well, you are in exactly the right place. Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to apply a rigorous structural loop to understand the actual mechanics of ethical choice. We'll quickly hit the anatomy of moral dilemmas, look at classical decision-making frameworks, transition right into the mechanics of dilemma theory, dissect conflict escalation mechanisms, and finally, resolve it all with reconciliation and macro integration. Let's dive in. All right, Section 1, the anatomy of moral dilemmas. This is the fundamental unit of ethical conflict, and we need to establish its precise parameters right up front. So let's start with our core concept. We classify the moral dilemma squarely within ethical philosophy, specifically normative ethics. By definition, a moral dilemma is a situation where a person must choose between actions that uphold different ethical values that simply cannot be reconciled. The absolute crux of the issue here is that both choices possess completely valid moral justifications, which creates severe internal friction. To see this classification in action, imagine a doctor struggling with allocating limited life-saving treatments. Do they exhaust absolutely all available resources to save one critically ill patient, or do they distribute those exact same resources to help multiple patients with a higher statistical survival rate? It's a severe internal conflict, grounded in undeniably valid moral justifications on both sides of a concrete wall. Now, what's really interesting here is how these dilemmas actually scale across different spheres of human experience. We can classify their application into three distinct domains. First up, personal dilemmas. These directly affect one's ethical integrity, like deciding whether to withhold the truth just to protect a loved one's feelings. Second, societal dilemmas, which encompass broader community debates like capital punishment. And finally, professional dilemmas, such as a journalist deciding whether to publish a story that exposes corruption but risks harming innocent people in the process. So what's the implication of all this? Well, these aren't just dry academic exercises. They generate profound psychological and emotional stress. When individuals face these unreconcilable choices, it causes immediate moral distress, guilt, or regret, especially if a choice leads to harm. But most importantly for our structural analysis, the weight of these decisions fundamentally shapes an individual's moral beliefs and heavily dictates their future behavioral repertoire. Moving right along to Section 2, decision-making frameworks. We are shifting our focus from defining the problem to examining the classical philosophical toolsets historically used to resolve them. To build out our analytical capacity, let's look at a strict taxonomic breakdown of three key ethical frameworks. First, utilitarianism, whose guiding principle is the greatest good for the greatest number, using a strictly outcome-based metric. Second, deontological ethics, which follows absolute moral rules regardless of the outcome, relying on a rigid rule-based metric. And third, virtue ethics, which focuses on acting in alignment with intrinsic moral character and integrity, utilizing a character-based metric. Let's actually apply this taxonomy to a classic example you've probably heard of, the trolley problem. Notice the friction between the metrics here. A utilitarian, using an outcome-based metric, pulls the lever to sacrifice one person to save five. Makes sense, right? However, a deontologist, adhering strictly to a rule-based metric against causing harm, refuses to actively participate in the killing of the one. Two different frameworks yielding two entirely different systemic actions. The real-world implication here, in practice, individuals rarely rely on a single rigid framework. The sheer dynamism of complex reality demands a combinatorial approach. Resolving real-world dilemmas requires us to dynamically combine these ethical principles rather than striving for perfect ideological purity. Which brings us to Section 3, the mechanics of dilemma theory. This is where we transition our explainer from individual moral philosophy directly into the systemic sociological dynamics of interpersonal behavior. Okay, We classify this concept within organizational behavior, specifically cultural and interpersonal dynamics. Dilemma theory defines a dilemma as a choice between two attractive, mutually exclusive options. But here's the critical part, the real game changer. Repeated resolution toward one option crystallizes into an unconscious preference. Over time, this preference deeply solidifies into a personal or cultural value. We literally stop realizing we're making a choice. We just assume it's the natural, normal way to act. Let's look at a concrete example. Meet Karen and Jenny. Karen has this crystallized preference for feeling. She strongly values subjectivity, expressing emotion, and working collegiately. Jenny, on the other hand, operates on an entirely different crystallized preference for thinking. She values objectivity, emotional distance, and sorting things out completely alone. Both approaches offer very real advantages, but they are absolutely mutually exclusive in the exact moment of action. And this perfectly illustrates the behavioral ecosystem they belong to. It's an infinite loop connecting subjectivity and objectivity. These aren't just isolated traits, they are deeply complementary values. The more one value is expressed, the greater the systemic need becomes for the other. Actually, Karen's subjectivity desperately needs Jenny's objectivity to balance it out, and vice versa. The implication of these internalized preferences is where things get dangerous. When opposing worldviews collide, like Karen's and Jenny's, and the individuals view their preference as an unchangeable identity, it generates intractable conflict. It creates a highly destructive us versus them dynamic that severely limits behavioral responsiveness and flexibility across an entire organization. This leads us seamlessly into Section 4, conflict escalation mechanisms. This is what happens when those complementary values mutate into deeply destructive system traps. Let's define the specific pathological mechanisms at play in interpersonal dynamics. First, we have Argyrius's concept of skilled incompetence. This is the bizarre mismatch between what people say and what they unconsciously do, driven by those unexamined preferences we just talked about. Second is Bateson's concept of schismogenesis. That's a big word, but it simply means the splitting apart of complementary values, where an initially small behavioral difference gets progressively larger and more extreme through repeated interaction. So let's map out the exact interaction of schismogenesis. Think of a cycle. One person enthusiastically shares an idea. The other, perhaps a bit overwhelmed, responds by becoming quiet to encourage calm. Interpreting that quietness as disinterest, the first person gets louder. In response, the second person withdraws even further. What starts as a tiny difference in style rapidly polarizes into extreme opposing behaviors. They push each other to the extreme, rigid edges of their respective values. The implications of this kind of escalation are actually pretty severe. When people fall into this system's trap, they bound the scope of their inquiry. It operates exactly as a success to the successful archetype, meaning individuals strictly reinforce the values they already possess while severely neglecting the complementary areas requiring their personal growth. They literally paralyze their own development because they refuse to learn from the opposing value. Finally, we hit Section 5, reconciliation and macro-integration. This is how we escape the trap. How do we actually design fluid, sustainable action? We classify this concept under resolution mechanisms. Now, we define reconciliation not as some weak compromise, but as understanding the profound circularity of complementary values. Rather than disrupting the connection, reconciliation strengthens the flow of movement between opposing values, consciously honoring the necessity of both options. In practice, this looks like moving from a rigid identity to a highly adaptive behavioral repertoire. Instead of Karen stubbornly saying, "I am a feeler," permanently locking herself into one mode, she reframes her value into a situational process. Before making a decision, I like to test ideas by experiencing how they affect my emotions. This dissolves the unconscious preference entirely and yields what the academic literature calls sensitive thoughtfulness or thoughtful sensitivity. And this brings us to our ultimate implication, macro-integration. A unified model linking philosophical ethics, what we value, with dilemma theory, how we interact. True mastery is the fluid sequencing between reflection, action, and integrating new data. Conflict is no longer a pathology to be feared. It becomes a permanent dynamic engine for ongoing self-knowledge and optimal organizational health. So we've moved from normative ethics right down to the mechanics of interpersonal resolution. But look, the learning doesn't stop just because this explainer ends. I want to leave you with a direct challenge based on the exact academic framework we've just covered. How will you actively apply sensitive thoughtfulness to suspend your own deeply internalized unconscious values during your very next interpersonal conflict? Think about it. Map your own choices and use the friction to grow. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I will see you next time.